Okay, I am now quoting myself, which is always a very appealing thing to do in front of people. Here we go. After a few years immersed in the science and experience of our most misunderstood emotion, I've discovered about myself what I've discovered about others. Regret makes me human. Regret makes me better. Regret gives me hope.
This is the last paragraph of Daniel Pink's new book, The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward, as read by Dan himself. And with it, I think we capture a lot of what is so intriguing about this book. The idea that regret is one of the most misunderstood emotions, and that it makes us human, makes us better, and should, if understood, give us all hope.
Yeah, I love how Dan is applying these insights to himself. And yet, because regret is universal, the application of his solutions in the book are universal too. He says that if we can better understand regret and how to harness its power, we can improve our lives. And that is only one of the many takeaways that we had from this conversation.
Indeed it is. And we will talk about that concept and those takeaways both in the interview, but also in our grooving session at the end. And in case you were wondering, this is Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt.
And I'm Tim. We explore human nature and behavior with researchers, authors, and practitioners in a conversational setting in order to bring their insights to you.
Today's episode, as I'm hoping most of you have already surmised, is with best-selling author, now turned part-time researcher, Daniel Pink.
Daniel H. Pink is the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestsellers When and A Whole New Mind, as well as the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell is Human. Dan's books have won multiple awards, have been translated into 42 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. I hope you get the idea that he's a pretty popular writer.
He is a pretty popular writer, but in addition to that, he was also the host and co-executive producer of Crowd Control, a television series about human behavior, Tim. That's pretty cool, right?
Super cool.
And it was on National Geographic and it aired in more than 100 countries. And before venturing out on his own 20 years ago, Dan worked in politics and in government, including serving as chief speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore from 1995 to 1997. He's also, as he says sometimes regrettably, a Yale Law School grad and has received honorary doctorates from Georgetown University, the Pratt Institute, the Ringling College of Art and Design, University of Indianapolis, and the Westfield State University.
So what you're saying is he's a great author and he's super smart?
No, I think that is the message, yes.
Yeah, copy that. Okay, Kurt and I have followed Dan's writings for many, many years, and we have been enthusiastic supporters of many of his books.
We found that his most recent book on regret was excellent, partially because he did a lot of qualitative and quantitative research to add to the literature, which is really cool. And he really dug into it, and he let the data speak for itself.
Yeah, we are super impressed that this incredibly talented author is evolving into what we think is a world-class researcher.
Yeah, now, he might not say that, right? Actually,
yeah,
he does say that he isn't doing that, but that's okay. Listen to that in the interview, folks. But right now, let's let Dan tell his story. It's time for you to sit back and relax by balancing your glass of anticipated regret and enjoy our conversation with Daniel Pink.
Daniel Pink, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
I'm glad to be with you.
We are always super excited to have you here. And as always, we start with a speed round. So I get to start. So, Dan, coffee first thing in the morning or tea first thing in the morning?
Easy, coffee. I don't drink tea.
Coffee. Okay. All right.
Tea is for wimps.
Tea is for wimps.
Take that, Mary.
Second part of that question, do you drink that right away? Or do you wait 60 or 90 minutes before you drink it?
Depends on the day.
Oh, so there are some mornings where you do delay. You wait a little bit.
Yeah.
Cool. We're pulling that from When.
Thank you for remembering that. Yeah,
as you remember. Second question. We've heard you say that some of the best conversations that you've had with people were over food. So, would you prefer to have a dinner conversation with your favorite athlete, your favorite musician, or your favorite scientist?
That's a tough one. in an ideal world, I would invite all three.
Oh,
because I think the exchange of all those, and I love the way you pick those particular professions, because I think there's stuff to learn from all of them, and I think there'd be some really great cross-pollination.
Any names come to mind? Just that this isn't part of the speed round, but just curious.
So
any of them, musician, athlete, or scientist.
I would love to talk to LeBron. I think he's extraordinary. I think that he has a memory unlike any I've ever seen, and I want to know sort of how he does that. Scientist, so many different scientists out there could fit the bill on this one. I actually might want to talk to somebody like a Brian Greene, who can maybe explain to me like quantum physics and astronomy and all that sort of stuff that makes my head hurt. And then, you know what? Another athlete I think would be maybe Serena.
Oh,
and if I could invite musician, that's a harder one. That's a harder one. You know what? Maybe this is going to sound strange, but maybe Emmylou Harris.
I think that's a great answer.
Yeah, because she's been around for a while, and she's had a very sustained career, and she transcends genres. So if you guys can work on those invites, just tell me the day, and
we'll get working on that. No problem. So, okay, third question: is it possible to compare Julius Caesar in the same sentence as Elmo from Sesame Street?
It's not only possible, it is essential to do that in order to make one's case in a chapter in this new book.
And how exactly would an author go about taking Elmo and Julius Caesar and comparing them together? Because at face value, they do not seem anything at all alike, and yet you are able to do this masterfully.
Except when we listen to them, we realize that both are fond of talking about themselves in the third person. Both when Julius Caesar wrote about his exploits as a warrior, and also Elmo when Elmo wrote about Elmo's. Anytime Elmo talks about Elmo uses Elmo.
All right. It is lovely. Okay, last speed round question: are Americans more likely to floss or to experience regret?
Tie. Oh, no, actually, no. The Americans are slightly more likely to experience regret than they are to floss their teeth.
That's cool.
It's not a tie. Yeah.
And how do you know that? Tell us about how you.
I know that because I conducted a very large survey, public opinion survey of 4,489 Americans, asking them a whole bunch of questions, including a question about regret that avoided using the word regret by design. And I asked them, how often do you look back on your life and wish you had done something differently? And we got something like 83% of people saying they did it occasionally, which is actually more often than people floss their teeth. Yeah. Now, I happen to both floss and regret, proving what a versatile performer I am.
One of the few, truly, obviously, as we see it here. But that's pretty amazing when you think about that. So this is obviously from your new book, Regret, The Power of Regret. Tell us a little bit about what was the catalyst for writing this book. Was it an article? Did you read a comment somewhere? Was it me search? Where was the catalyst for starting this book?
Well, it's an interesting point, Kurt, because like that old line that all research is me search, and so there's certainly an element of that here. This is not a book I would have written, I don't think, in my 30s. Oh. I've been writing books for 20 years. It's a book that in a weird way felt kind of inevitable in my 50s because I had some mileage on me and I had some room to look back. And I realized that I was looking back and had regrets. And the curious thing, you guys interview people and you have a sense of that. Every once in a while you bring up a topic and people lean in. And when I started talking about regrets, my own regrets with people, I was skittish. I thought they might recoil. But I found they really leaned in. They were eager to hear, and they were also eager to divulge their own. And as interviewers, like, whoa, there's something going on there. And so actually on this book, I was working on a totally different book. And because I started thinking about this and getting such an interesting reaction from people, I actually put aside that book for a month, started doing some research, wrote an entirely new, like 25, 30 page proposal. And then one morning surprised my editor by emailing him and saying, "Hey, Jake, I got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that book you think I'm writing, I haven't been working on. The good news is that I think I got something better. See attached. Sincerely, Dan."
And he bought it.
First of all, my editor, my longtime editor at Riverhead Books, Jake Morrissey, is just perhaps the loveliest human being on the planet. Very, very smart and just a good human being all around. And he's an open-minded guy. He said, "Okay, let me see," and we worked it out.
And I'm sure he said it with that same inflection, like, "Okay, let's see." Right? That's how it works.
Yeah. No, Jake is an Irish Catholic guy from Vermont, so he doesn't do the like Larry David Brooklynese that I can do so effortlessly.
That's pretty terrific. When we were talking about sort of how to prepare for our conversation with you, Dan, Mary noticed that there's sort of a Charles Dickens-esque, almost like a little bit of Christmas Carol thing going on. We got the regrets of the past, we got the regrets of the present, we got the regrets of the future, right? I mean, you kind of see that. Yeah. So have you thought of yourself as sort of a modern day Jacob Marley? Are you?
No, I have not. But you make an interesting point though about the temporal dimension of regret, and it's actually really important in understanding regret. And our very ability to experience regret is because human beings have this incredible power. It's amazing. We don't stop and think about it, to basically travel in our head through time.
Yeah.
To go backward in time and think about what things were like, and then go forward in time and imagine what things were like. And you pair that with our incredible storytelling capabilities, the fact that human beings are natural narrators and storytellers. You pair those two things, and that's what gives regret its oomph. And it's a really, what's interesting, I think, about regret as an emotion is how complex it is, how cognitively complex it is. And this is why, little kids can't experience regret. 5-year-olds can't experience regret. Their brains haven't developed enough. And to me, that's just something very telling about. There's something very telling about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, particularly as you think about using regret, as you talk about in the book, about changing your behavior and doing the different pieces of that, in particular about anticipated regret and aspects around that. Kind of Scrooge, right? He got to see the future, and he's like, I don't like that future. Alfred Nobel, as you talk about in the book, all of those kind of things. We talked with Roy Baumeister, and he told us that he believed that anticipated regret was one of our biggest motivators. And it sounds like you agree, but maybe with some reservations. So you want to talk about that?
I think it is a very important motivator. There's no question about that. And like many motivators, and you guys have done a lot of work on motivation, like many motivators, it can motivate us, but does it motivate us for good or ill? And I think that the answer with anticipated regret is that it's generally a pretty good and useful motivator. But as I say in the book, it should probably come with a warning label, because it can steer us in wrong directions. Particularly true when it comes to risk aversion. And my favorite example of this is something, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and in the still even then the era of standardized tests. We're taking standardized tests all the time, or even multiple choice tests in school. And the counsel always was, don't switch your answer.
Yeah.
Go with your first instinct. You think it's C, and then you come back and you think it's A. Don't switch. And I was always, and I just believed that because I'm like a gullible dude from the Midwest. And then for this, I started looking at the research, and what it showed pretty clearly is that you actually should switch your answer. You're more likely to get it right if you switch your answer. But the reason we don't switch our answer is anticipated regret, gone awry, because we anticipate incredible regret from switching from a right answer to a wrong answer, but we don't anticipate the appropriate amount of regret from simply sticking with the wrong answer. That when we take an action, it becomes much more salient, and so we're more likely to regret it. And so this anticipated regret of going from right to wrong prevents us from doing the right thing. So there are examples of that, but it's important. And also the other thing about anticipated regret that's so interesting, I think, is that it's important that we anticipate, that we don't overdo it. We can't anticipate every regret. It can be paralyzing. Should I buy a blue car? Am I going to regret buying a blue car or a gray car? Am I going to regret, having LeBron for dinner or Serena for dinner? You know, you can get paralyzed by that. And so I think it's important that we anticipate the regrets that we know are going to be the most important factors in leading a good and productive and meaningful life.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't help the Monty Hall problem that Gilovich researched right on this. Like it has to be in part because I don't want to change my answer because it's so salient. It's so important to me right now. Like this is the only thing I have to do. This is the most important thing. Oh my God, I can't change my answer.
If there's only one thing your listeners learned from this hour together with all of us is if you're on, let's make a deal, switch.
You heard it first from Dan Pagel.
It's like the Monty Hall problem. It'll hurt my head to go over it too carefully. When I first encountered it, I didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense to me. And no joke, I have one of my daughters is a very, very good kind of math science person, just always been like super adept at that. And when she was about 16, she explained it to me, and I understood it for like 5 minutes. Oh. And then, but here's the thing with me: it's like I always can see the big picture, and it's like, okay, switch.
Yeah.
So switch your answer on standardized tests. Switch your answer. Switch the door the door you
number
pick
2.
On. Let's make a deal.
Well, you understood it for 5 minutes longer than I understood it, so that's all I have to say there. But that is really good.
One of the things that really struck me personally when I was reading the book is that your career seems to be evolving from a writer to a researcher. You seem to be investing a lot more time in research. You just sort of shrugged for those of our listeners who can't see that. But is that a fair assessment or not so fair?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's not something that it's not something that I'm consciously. It's not like a conscious strategic decision. It's just that, like for this particular book, what I had ideas for how to do my own research on this. And part of that was because I felt like some of the research on regret, a lot of it is very, very good. I felt that some of it was a little bit too theoretical. And didn't yield enough practical insights. And so that's one of the things that I like from research. And also the other thing about it, is that it's become a lot easier to do that. I mean, if you think about your ability to like I was able to do a pretty sophisticated piece of survey research for not that much money without basically leaving my office. And I was able to, go through the data in part with the help of my that same daughter who now has a master's in computational social science.
Wow.
And go through some of that. But even I can go through some of that. Even I can go, and it's kind of remarkable when you think about it. I had a job once years and years ago when I was in high school. I grew up as I said, in Columbus, Ohio, which is the state capital. And so I had a job once, like doing calls for like a polling firm. And I think about like that, where you're like on a landline calling people and getting their answers. And I'm like marking things with a pencil, and then versus the ability to assemble these panels, do it online, get the data immediately, go into the data and be able to do, even a schmo like me, go into the data and be able to like do cross tabs and other kinds of analysis. It's just amazing how good the tools are and how easy it is. And so that's kind of exciting to me. But this is like, I appreciate your calling it an evolution. It's just like, to me, it was more like the next thing that I did.
We've talked to Ron Kivitz at Columbia University. I don't know if you know Ron, but he did some research that is not published about regret when he went to alumni gatherings and asked alumni who were 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, and 50 years out of school about their spring break of senior year. Did they stay back at school and study, or did they go party? Right. And I think you're probably anticipating the results already, right? That the 1 year, 5 year grads were like, oh man, I shouldn't have partied. I should have stayed and studied. But by the time you get out to 50 years, the regret reverses. And the 50-year grads were like, I went and I stayed and studied and I shouldn't have. I really regret not going and partying. And I'm wondering if you plan on continuing this, both the American and the world studies? Do you to go back and develop some longitudinal work on any of this?
Perhaps. I mean, I could go back on the world. The quantitative part was a one-time thing. I'm still gathering in the World Regret Survey, which is the qualitative thing, where I just said, tell me about one of your regrets, and we got this extraordinary number of regrets from 105 countries, and they're still coming in. Every time I go to the database, you can see a little thing in the upper right-hand corner about how many people are filling it out right now, and there's always somebody on there. Cool. And so I might, I think I would continue that. It's an interesting question about whether there are going to be longitudinal differences. Differences. I saw the one thing that I saw sort of as a proxy for that in the quantitative stuff was differences in age, particularly when it came to regrets of action versus inaction. Yeah. It sort of goes to your point of your question. What I found is that in this American sample, at age 20, people had about equal numbers of action regrets. I regret what I did. Inaction regrets. I regret what I didn't do. But as people age, inaction regrets predominate. But that spring break research reminds me of one of my favorite regrets from the book. I collected all these regrets from around the world, and one of my favorite comes from a 58-year-old woman in Colorado. So I knew from the database, I asked people's age and I asked their gender. They would submit anonymously. They could include their email address if they wanted to do a follow-up interview. So all I know from her is that she's a 58-year-old female in Colorado, but she says her big regret is not going to see Prince in concert because it was a school night. Tons of school nights versus one Prince. Stupid choice.
I loved that one too. Yeah. I love that.
One of my all-time favorites. I tried to get into, I said, I saw that one. I was like, okay, I had a folder over there on my desk, and it's like the ones that have to go in. And that was one of them.
No, I'm so glad, because Kurt and I live in a town where Prince grew up, and I've actually recorded at Paisley Park. And so this whole idea of giving up one night for Prince is like, holy Hannah, of course you would.
Yeah. Yeah. But at the time,
absolutely need to do
but
that.
at the time, you don't necessarily realize that unless the person is sitting there thinking about anticipated regrets. It's like, I got a lot of schoolwork tomorrow. I got a lot of things to do. I'll probably regret that because my parents will yell at me or whatever else will happen. And you don't extend out that time horizon long enough to realize that the regret from a long-term life is probably going to be much bigger about missing that one-time opportunity versus that short-term, all right, my parents will be disappointed, my teacher will be mad, whatever else has happened within there. And I think that's one of the bigger issues as we think about this is the anticipated regret, but also, trying to understand, like, can we really understand what's going to be the bigger regret as we move forward in our life?
We can't know that, Kurt, but I think we can predict it with some accuracy.
Okay, and how do we do that?
Not perfect accuracy, but some accuracy, because again, because here's the thing, going to this massive collection of regrets, what I found in looking them over and sitting here in this office and doing the laborious work of reading through them all and trying to sort them, is that around the world, people kept expressing the same 4 regrets over and over again. And one of those regrets was one of the big categories were boldness regrets, which is, if only I'd taken the chance. Now, let me take a step back, because it goes to something you guys were saying earlier. So traditionally, when researchers have looked at regrets, really the question of what people regret, they tabulate regrets, and they do it by the domain of somebody's life. This is an education regret. This is a career regret. This is a health regret. And that's what I did in my quantitative survey. I had people put them in these categories. And throughout the research on regret, the answer kept coming up the same. People regret a lot of different stuff. And I'm like, I'll figure this out. I'll ask them. And I determined people regret a lot of different stuff. And then in the qualitative stuff, I noticed something else going on, and forgive this long-winded answer, but I think it makes a point. So what you have is that you have, let's say, people who went to college. I'm amazed at the number of people who went to college and regretted not studying abroad. That was a big regret for a lot of people. Okay, so that's an education regret. Then I have regrets all over the country. If someone had a crush on somebody, a man or a woman who they really liked, they didn't ask them out, they wanted to, but they were too chicken. I have hundreds of those from around the world. That's a romance regret. Then I have people who say, I always wanted to start a business, but I didn't do it. and didn't step up and do it, that's a career regret. But those are all the same regret into my mind. Those are regrets that say, if only I'd taken the chance. And it doesn't so much matter the domain of life that you're in. It is the taking the chance itself. And what does that tell us? That tells us that human beings, I think, that human beings want to learn and grow, that we want to lead psychologically rich lives. And so I think that if we know that, we can anticipate regrets. So we can take that 58-year-old woman in Colorado and spin her back in time and say, whatever, her 17-year-old self, and say, listen, like, you know what? Going to a Prince concert is part of leading a psychologically rich life and an act of boldness. And what we know, the prediction is going to be that you will regret missing Prince much more than you will regret not doing something on a school night. And again, but it's a balance, because if she were taking, oh, you know what? I had my medical boards the next day and I went to see a Prince conference. I mean, I don't mean that as a joke, because like that's a different calculus. Right. And you have people who have regrets about not something as dramatic as that, but you have plenty of people who big regret or foundation regrets, which are, if only I'd done the work. Yeah. People who didn't work hard enough in school. So there are plenty of that, and so, you can think of that. So I think we know what people are going to regret. We can make an educated guess about what people are going to regret the most. And it ends up being these four core things that I think reveal a lot about what makes life worth living.
Okay. You just touched on something that's a really, really nice, important part about this, and that is the balance. Because when reading about boldness, there's oh man, I should have kissed her. I should have asked her out. Stories like this. But then there's also the moral regret of, I shouldn't have slept with him. I shouldn't have gotten involved with this woman, whatever the story is.
Yeah.
And there was a part of me that was like, well, does the boldness regret say, well, we should just act on our impulses, but we have this moral thing that says, no, we've got social rules that we need to sort of play by, right?
It's a great question, and it depends. I think that in general, we should err toward taking sensible risks. I think in general, the people who I heard from didn't take enough risks. There were people who said, I regret starting a business and having it fail. There were definitely people like that. But for every one of those, there were 25 who regretted not doing that. So, so it's not like it's completely binary. Now, the moral stuff is very interesting, because we don't have we meaning human beings, we don't have a uniform sense of what it means to be moral. We have some things that we share. You shouldn't harm people. You shouldn't cheat people. But on other things, I have people in the database and I talk to them, who regret, for instance, not serving in the military. And there's some people, because they think that they didn't uphold their duty. And I can totally understand that as a moral regret. But I mentioned that to somebody a few weeks ago, and they said, well, what that's okay. Why are you bothered by that? Like, and it's like, well, because your moral code doesn't really have a facet of duty as some people do. And it's not right or wrong. It's just different. I mean, I had, let's take something totally uncontroversial, abortion. I had, it's like this country is very divided on the morality of abortion. And I had people who, several women who their big regret was terminating a pregnancy. And that is for them, that was a moral breach. For someone else, that might not be a moral breach. And so with morality, it's like, okay, you just, I really think you have to be, we have to, this is, and from reading the book, like John Haidt's work on moral psychology has changed my view on a lot of that we have to have, I think, a more expansive view of morality. And I do think that people like me, who might be a little bit more on the kind of secular end of the spectrum, and it might be a little bit more on the slightly left of center part of the political spectrum, need to recognize that the moral code that we believe in is not the right moral code. It is a moral code. And there are other people who have a moral code that is different, not worse, just different.
Yeah. And I think you bring up Jonathan Haidt. I think that's wonderful on that. So We've talked about, you said you had 4 different kinds of regrets as we've talked about here, and you've talked about boldness. We've talked a little bit about foundation. Maybe you can expand on that. And then you talked about moral regrets. And then there's connecting or connection regrets. You want to expand a little bit more on the foundational one and then talk a little bit about the connection, because I think our listeners will want to know.
Yeah, foundation's pretty simple. It's if only I'd done the work. And so these are people who, I have a lot of people who regret not saving money. I have a lot of people who regret not, around the world especially, less in the United States, a lot from different parts of the world, about regretting smoking. I have a lot of people who regret not taking care of their health. So those are, like, small decisions that we make that end up that over time accumulate into bigger problems. So that's a pretty important. And again, each of these regrets, as I argue, surfaces a need that we have, and I think the need is stability. And I don't want to. I think sometimes we don't, in our reveling over kind of what makes life worth living, we forget that stability actually is a very important part of people's lives. That it's hard to appreciate. It's harder to lead a psychologically rich life if you're in fear, if you're insecure, if you're worried about your stability all the time. But connection regrets are a really interesting one. And it's the biggest category, as you say. And it deals with, not surprisingly, with relationships. But a very expansive notion of relationships. To me, again, as a layperson looking at this, just looking at the world, I feel like we sort of over-indexed on romantic relationships and under-indexed on the importance of a wider swath of relationships, as people told me. So connection regrets are, you have a relationship, or you should have had a relationship, or it should have been intact or was intact, and then it comes apart. And I think one of the interesting things about these connection regrets is that they come apart in profoundly undramatic ways in most cases. They're just, it's just not that interesting. They just kind of drift. And as a consequence, it comes further apart. And one person says, oh, I should reach out, but no, it's going to be awkward and they're not going to care. And so they drift further apart. And these are things like, again, it's not so much romantic relationships. That's part of it, but it's relationships, parents and kids, siblings, relatives, friends. One of my takeaways from this is the deep meaning of friendship in people's lives. Now, that might seem kind of self-evident, but to hear it in people's voices, how much drifting apart from friends hurt and how much reconnecting with them meant, it was really powerful to me. So connection regrets are, if only I'd reached out. And for me personally, you guys, that was I think the biggest personal takeaway. I really do. I mean, I basically have decided based on this that, if one, meaning me or anybody, but if I'm at a juncture where I think, should I reach out or should I not reach out? I've answered the question. I should reach out. That simply getting to that juncture gives you the answer to that question. And I really mean that. Always reach out. One of the things that stuck with me is the number of people who have regrets about missed funerals. And I didn't write about that in the book, but it's something there. And I have a regret about that. There's a guy who I worked with, lovely guy, and he had a funeral. And the funeral actually, it's embarrassing. The funeral was actually walking distance to my house. And for whatever reason, on the day of the funeral, I wasn't like a close friend of his, but I'd worked with him and I liked him. On the day of the funeral, whatever, I had a deadline or something like that, and I was thinking about going, and I decided not to go, and I didn't go, and it still bugs me. And it's not like anybody in his family says, "Oh, where's Dan? I can't believe he didn't show up." It was all, I was not at all in a tight inner circle, but again, it's a form of reaching out. So for me, it's like, always reach out, always go to the funeral. If you're thinking about it, do it.
Yeah. I hear that in the stories that you tell in the book, I think are really powerful and really show that. And I think that's really a fascinating part of this book. I've also heard, and you mentioned this just like here, like this part didn't make it into the book, that you go through a very intensive process of researching your books, sometimes spending months and months kind of on one area or a couple different areas. And then sometimes only a few sentences might get into the book, or sometimes maybe not any of that getting into the book. So for this book, what was it that you had to cut or maybe limit that you go, God, if it was just more interesting, or it could have, had a 300, 500 page book, I would have loved to put this in, but because I couldn't, what were some of those pieces that you had for regret?
Well, your listeners don't know that I have my face in my hands and I'm shaking my head right now.
Exactly.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, sorry to give you, the regret that you couldn't put this in.
No, but here's the thing. Okay, I'm happy to talk about this because it's very therapeutic for me. So there were a few things. One of them had to do with the basically regret and child development, and I spent about a month reading the papers on that and reading it over. And then when I started writing about it, I realized I could pretty much write it all in one paragraph.
Wow.
And so the only thing worse than writing it, spending a month going through this stuff and writing it in one paragraph, the only thing worse than that would have been spending a month writing about it over 5 pages and torturing readers. And so, so you have to do that. I had this great idea of like, I'm going to come up with the ultimate rules of regret, like how regret really operates. And I had this giant file with all that stuff. And, I had a whiteboard going and I started working on it and reading and crossing stuff out and doing it. And I was like, I'm not sure there are these rules because I think they all basically come back to the difference between action and inaction. Yeah. And I just said it. So maybe that's not a chapter. So, again, but that's writing, that's thinking, that's researching. That's just the break. That's just the breaks of the game. And I don't like it. Believe me, I don't like it. But what I dislike more is not serving readers well or falling into the sunk cost fallacy. It's like, well, I spent a month researching it, so it has to have 5 pages. No, it doesn't.
Well, bravo to you, Dan, for being willing to kill your darlings and having the ability to see to see clearly. That's not an easy thing to do. Obviously, not all of us do that very well.
Well, it's something that I learned how to do in that, I sort of have a brutal approach to the stuff that I write in the sense that I essentially require every sentence to make the case to me why it shouldn't be cut. Because one of the things that I dislike about books that I've read is that, and again, this has gotten me in trouble with like people in the publishing industry and whatever. Just, not in trouble, but people arguing with me, thinking that I'm like, like a Philistine or an anti-intellectual. But people saying that my view is that many books, particularly nonfiction books, are too long. Yeah. That the writers, they're not rigorous enough in just paring it down, getting to the point, eliminating the fluff. And that's something that I try to do in my books because I admire it in other books.
Mary was the one that brought up this Dickens Christmas Carol thing. I almost saw the book like a novel. There was a part of me that was like, you have to set up the characters and then you bring in the conflict between the characters and then everything gets resolved, at the end, where like the Odyssey doesn't get resolved. Ulysses, Odysseus doesn't even find Penelope until like book 18, of the 24 books, and there was this real sense of jubilation in getting those last 3 chapters of just going, wow, this is just the payoff was terrific, Dan.
Well, thanks for that. I appreciate that. You're giving me a little bit too much credit for A, evolving, like, oh, you're evolving into a researcher, and B, constructing it like a novelist. But I do think, for the listeners who might be interested in this, I think that in most kinds of writing, I'm kind of a structuralist when it comes in my view about writing. I think that structure is one of the most important things in any kind of writing project. And for me, even if it is a shorter piece, but certainly for a book, the first part of doing it for me is a discovery of like, what is the structure? And for me, once I begin figuring out the structure, I begin seeing it more clearly, more clearly in my head. And so the structure of this book, as I went through the research, it took me a while to figure this out. But I did have a breakthrough once. I remember it. I was out for a walk with my wife, and I said, "Oh, wait a second. The first part is about reclaiming regret. Okay, so we're going to call that regret reclaimed." And I use that word reclaim in some of the writing. It's like, okay, we have this emotion, we haven't understood it. Let's reclaim it. Then it's like, well, wait a second. I'm also doing this research to reveal regret. So the second part is regret revealed, and then as Tim is saying, I want to talk about what to do about it. So let's talk about regret remade. Yeah. And once I saw those three sections, that structure, I was like, oh, okay, this book is beginning to reveal to me what it actually is.
I also want to call to mind that self-compassion was an important part of the book as well. So that seemed to have a pretty big impact on you.
Yeah, it did. Thank you for noticing that, because I guess part of it was I was clueless about self-compassion until I started doing this research, and I think that part of it, I know I'm embarrassed to say that, and part of it, I guess, being like at least a self-identified, like non-touchy-feely, rational guy, that I just, maybe I didn't gravitate because of the word. And then I started looking at the research, and I was just blown away. It is a powerful concept. The other thing that surprised me in self-compassion is again, sort of adjacent to that, is some of the big downsides of self-esteem. Self-esteem is not all good, obviously. And I didn't know a lot of that work, but also I was really surprised by the research showing the efficacy of self-criticism, because it doesn't exist. Self-criticism is like, I couldn't find much evidence at all that self-criticism is useful. That most of it seems to me like a form of kind of virtue signaling to yourself. Look what a hard ass I'm being on myself. Look, I really am a serious performer. I'm going to, talk to myself like I'm the great Santini.
Yeah. And I think you
I don't know where that one came from.
The Grant Santini.
but I like Pat Conroy. I like Pat Conroy, and I like Robert Duvall in the movie. So
I think it's interesting, though, as you talk about this idea of the self-compassion, but criticism doesn't work. And we know that, the research also shows that criticism doesn't necessarily work. And even if it's not self-criticism, if it's criticizing somebody and you're trying to improve their behavior. And so it just makes really good sense. And I really like how you brought that in. I do want to have you read a section of the book, because it's a really powerful piece, and it's just the last paragraph of the book. So could you find that for us? And if you wouldn't mind, I would love to have you read that. And then I want to ask you just a question about that.
Just the last paragraph, not the 10,000 that come before.
No, not the 10,000. Just summarize everything in that.
Context?
So this is all right. I'm gonna go on here a little bit, because you talked about this earlier. You said many times you think that there's authors write too much and they just kind of go. And I will echo that opinion. And Tim and I talked about this actually beforehand. There are too many times where you go, all right, the first 3 or 4 chapters of a book are good, and then it's like, oh, they're filling in. They got to get their 300 pages or whatever it is, and it's just like, oh, it's getting painful. Your book, it was started off good and it got better, and then I'm like, I'm waiting for the downfall, and it just kept getting better. And for me, this is like the green light at the end of the thing. And this is a Fitzgerald moment of the ending of your book here.
My Lord.
So there you go. So read this final paragraph here.
Okay. I am now quoting myself, which is always a very appealing thing to do in front of people. Here we go. After a few years immersed in the science and experience of our most misunderstood emotion, I've discovered about myself what I've discovered about others. Regret makes me human. Regret makes me better. Regret gives me hope.
It's amazing to me. I think that's you write beautifully across the entire book in different pieces, but I think it's really powerful. Yeah. But I think what's really interesting about this is the summarization of this, is that this part about your humanity. My God, I can't even talk here, right? And about making you better and about giving you hope. And so can you, not to have you explain that, because I think it's written really well, and for all of our listeners, go read the book, because I think the book will help you understand what you're saying there. But this human aspect, how does regret make us human? How does it make us better? And why do you think it gives us hope?
So, it makes us human because everybody has regrets. That's the thing. This is why I spent part of the book pushing back on this no regrets philosophy, which is absurd. Everybody has regrets. As you guys, not having regrets is a sign of a problem. It's a sign that you're 5 years old, or you have brain damage, or you're a sociopath. But everybody has regrets. And when we think about this, we say this is a very common emotion. Everybody has it. Well, let's think about this. It must serve some kind of purpose. And it does. That when we treat our regrets right, they are instructive. They clarify. They give us a path to do things better in the future. And so once we realize, that's the whole point about reclaiming this emotion. And at some level, I think I was reclaiming it for myself as well. You guys earlier asked, about, research as me search. And I'm confessing to that. And that, part of this was about how I was reckoning with my own regrets and saying, wait a second, I have these regrets and I never talk about them. And yet this one time when I started thinking about them because of this catalytic moment, and I started talking with other people, I had a reaction that really surprised me. What's going on here? And so I also think that you can't spend a couple of years on a book and have it not change you. I mean, and again, not to get all woo-woo on you here, but the me who started this is different from the me who finished this, because the me who finished this spent all this time looking through 16,000 regrets, all this time having people they're almost all Zoom interviews on Zoom break into tears because they felt bad about bullying somebody 40 years ago. Tell me about their infidelity. Tell me about dreams that went awry. And one of the things that came out of this, let's take moral regrets, for instance, is that the moral regrets give me hope, because the fact that people are bothered by these moral breaches 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, in some cases 60 years later after the incident, makes me think, gosh, you know what? We want to be good. And you can't have all these conversations and read all these stories of longing and aspiration without saying, you know what? Our species, as fucked up as it is, excuse me, can I say fucked up?
You can say fucked up as many times as you like.
Sorry. You can't read all these regrets and think about our species and say, as fucked up as it is, that there's still that we're still probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
That there's something fundamentally good and decent and aspirational about most of us. And that's what gave me hope.
You started the book, and you just alluded to this, Dan, with No Regrets, that magnificent song that Edith Piaf made popular. It became a tattoo meme within the book, which was pretty great. Loved that. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed there wasn't a little bit more on Edith Piaf or more music. And so I'm going to have to put you on the spot now and say, if you were on a desert island for a year, what would be the three artists that you would carry along with you? Musical artists.
The three musical artists.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very interesting one. So I'm going to go with, I have two immediately came to mind.
Good.
And, I got all three.
Okay.
It's an interesting question. I've never thought about it before. So Simon and Garfunkel.
Perfect.
Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh, yeah.
J.S. Bach.
Oh.
Fantastic choices as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. No, but it's interesting because you got to think about what would you I'm taking your exercise seriously. It's what would you want to listen to a lot?
Yep.
So if you look at my playlist for when I run, all right. So when I run on the treadmill, I've got, this is embarrassing, but I've got Three Dog Night and Men Without Hats and Bob Seger. It's I don't want to be stuck on a desert island with men without hats.
No,
I'll run to some Men Without Hats songs, but being on a desert island listening to only Men Without Hats is probably a punishment for a white collar crime somewhere in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a version of hell at some level. It's one of the levels in hell right there. So.
And even Bob Seger, who I like, it's oh my God, here it is again.
Yeah, but
I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore.
But one more, Against the Wind or Turn the Page is holy Hannah. Let's let go of that. I just have to ask, what we actually talked to someone recently. First of all, Bach has actually come up several times when we've asked this question. Bach is fairly common. I would tend to lean more toward Beethoven for my own personal classical choice, but again, personal choice. But Ella Fitzgerald has come up a bunch.
Really?
Yeah. And
I think part of it is that if I were on a desert island by myself, I would want that voice because that voice is the voice. It's such a human voice. It's a voice that might remind me that I'm human. And I don't even mean the melody so much as just her own actual voice and the way that she can take a song and just wring the emotion of it because it's so deeply human. So
I could take live at Berlin in 1960. I could take that record from Ella Fitzgerald as my only record from Ella, because in that she has perfection. She delivers songs just, exactly as you expect them. And then she tries Mac the Knife and fails terribly at the lyrics.
Oh, really?
Awful. Just like, and the audience is just, oh man, they're on pins and needles. Like they don't care if she's completely fucking up the words. It's like, oh my God, it's Ella Fitzgerald. It doesn't matter if she doesn't get the words right. And she's
fascinating.
So human.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. It's a super interesting exercise, but I hope it doesn't come to my being alone on a desert island.
There you go.
Well, we hope the same for you as well, and we are grateful for your time and your conversation today, Dan. Thank you for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves.
What a pleasure! I really enjoyed it.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Dan, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our regrettably human brains.
Oh, now wait a minute. Are you saying that you regret that we have brains?
No, I'm just regretting that they're human brains and they are,
not monkey brains?
Biased and, conspiracy theories and all that. Actually, I need to change that, don't I? I'm doing an if only we had better brains that didn't have these things, but I should say at least we have human brains, because look at what we've actually been able to do with those brains. Yeah.
It's very clever. We're going to have to come back to that.
All right.
We're going to absolutely have to come back to that. Let's say, so what do you think our grooving session should focus on here, Kurt?
So I think both from the book and from the session that we had with Dan, I think the key piece that I would kind of take away from this is that regret can be a tool that can be used to improve our lives if we understand regret and we understand how to use regret in a positive way to motivate us to overcome the pain that we feel with this and to make a difference in our lives. So I think that's really cool.
Well, then we have to start with the fact that regret is complex, that there's a lot of nuance to it. And I'm really grateful that Dan wrote the book and did the categories and sort of sifted through it all, both in qualitative and quantitative research, and kind of revealed the fact that it is just universal.
Yeah.
I mean, once it gets past like 6-7 years old, it's universal, right? The little kids don't.
Yeah, this idea that we all have it. It's part of what makes us human. It's this idea too that it's complex, as you said. I think he called it cognitively complex. This idea that we can have two people can do the exact same action, and one person can feel regret over it, and the other person, it doesn't matter. And there's various different phases and shades of all of that. And I think, as he mentions too, or this idea that hey, regret gets a bum rap, and it's always seen as a negative. And he's trying to change that, and he's saying, you know what? No. It's complex, it's universal, and we can use it to make our lives better.
But before we get to the make our lives better, maybe let's just do a quick recap on the 4 components that are in the book. How about if we start there?
So there's the foundational regrets, these ideas, these small things that we don't do or that we do that add up over time. This idea, I didn't study enough, so I got a bad grade. I didn't save enough, so now I don't have savings. This idea, I didn't exercise, or I ate too much all the time instead of, doing different things. Foundational regrets. And there's other regrets that I think, I want my kids to learn and to read this part of the book. I know they won't, but I would like that. Maybe they'll listen to the podcast, but even if they do, I think it's going to be hard because they don't have that part of their prefrontal cortex that is ready to receive this information yet. But this is the foundational stuff I wish I would have known when I was younger. But
that said, do you have any major foundational regrets?
Nah, I don't.
School, savings?
No, I'm pretty good. How about you?
I did when I was younger. I did after grad school. I regretted not doing better in high school so that I could have gotten into a more competitive undergrad program, which could have gotten me into a more competitive grad program. But you know what? Sand through the fingers. That all washed away. Fortunately, I did. Yeah, it really did. It ended up not being a big deal for me after I was in my mid-30s, I think.
Oh, wow.
So,
all right. So,
okay,
so next one is boldness regrets. And these are these,
great.
I didn't ask out the girl. I didn't go to the Prince concert because I was too worried I was going to study. I didn't go on spring break. And, so all of those things that we talked about. And I think those are really powerful. Those can be big ones. And again, the lesson here is, sometimes you just got to do stuff, even if it's going to mean that you get less sleep and do different things. So how about you, Tim? Any boldness regrets on your side?
Yes, absolutely. Big boldness regret from second year in college. I wanted to pursue the music industry as a career, went to LA, spent a few weeks in LA, interviewing with record industry execs during the day for the white collar job, playing clubs at night and open mics for the studio musician guy job. And after a couple of weeks left saying, it's not for me. I'm not going to do it.
So this is interesting. We've talked about this many times, and this idea, because you're going, this is a boldness regret. And I go, no, this is actually boldness in personified, because you went to LA. I don't know if you got on a bus and rode the bus out and did all of that, but you went to LA and you tried. You met with record executives. You played the clubs. You did the open mics. You did it. It wasn't this, sitting in, where were you in Nebraska at the time, right? Yeah. And going, I wish I should just go out to LA, and then never doing it. You did it.
And yet years later, after we talked to Annie Duke, I think maybe the first time a few years ago, Annie said, go back to a big decision that you made and really wrestle with it, really break it down. And so I did, and found that there was absolutely iron gauntlet, compelling, convincing reasons that I made the right decision. Oh. There was nothing that I could look at. And yet I still harbored that regret until you and Mary and I were talking about this, and you helped reframe this, as Dan Pink says, moved it from the if only into the at least, which you just did. And so when we had that conversation, it finally became sand through the fingers, and I finally let go of it. So that's a long story.
Well, thank you, Dan Pink, because we've gotten a regret off of Tim's shoulders. So there you go.
And thank you, Kurt Nelson and Mary Califf, for actually doing that. Okay.
All right.
How about moral?
I would never tell you about any of my moral regrets.
Oh, well, the moral regrets, and I don't have any because I grew up petty pure. But the moral regrets have to do with those moral foundations, things that we would oftentimes link with Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations. Careness and harm and authority and sanctity and did I enter the priesthood or not?
Yeah.
Did I serve military? Did I marry that person or not? With fidelity, those kinds of things.
And
so those are important.
Those are important. And it's one of the things I think Dan talked about too, in this complexity piece, the nuance piece. This is ones where, for some people, that's a moral regret. And for others, it's like, why would it? That's not even a moral thing. And so understanding those, and that's where Jonathan Haidt's work, I think, fits nicely into this, and the difference that we have in kind of our moral foundations that we have as individuals. Yeah. So,
but connections, the fourth one, that's a biggie for you.
Oh, man. Well, think about this. So what fascinated me is when Dan mentioned that this was the largest group of regrets, this idea that these connections, which, as you have said, don't end with a bang typically, that they kind of just drift. They float away, and like that person you were really close to, and now you don't talk to them for weeks, and then maybe you connect, and then it's months, and then it's years. And those are the ones. And so I think from our perspective, the lesson that I'm taking out of this is, look, that is the biggest group of regrets. So as people, what do we need to be focused in on? Is it our job? Is it how much money I'm making? Is it, healthy lifestyle? Yeah, all those things are important, but really make sure we stay connected with those people in our lives, that make sure we're working at building and maintaining those positive relationships. Reach out to that old friend, go to the wedding, go to the funeral, go to the birthday party, go to the dinner, reach out on Facebook, man, just do it. Just connect. If you ask yourself the question, should I reach out? You've already answered it. That was a great paraphrase of Dan. That's great. So I think that leads into, so those are the 4 foundational kind of archetypes of regret as Dan has outlined them. But that leads into the last part of his book, which I think is really interesting and really powerful, because it's the part where how do we apply this to make, to learn, to motivate ourselves, and to set a better future for ourselves. And this is where we get some tools of how to do this. And we already talked about one, this idea of at least versus if only, changing that self-talk. And that I think is really powerful, as you already talked about. Look, it changed this whole boldness regret that you've had, and now it's sand through your fingers, as you said.
There's 2 that kind of go together for me. One is self-disclosure, this idea of sharing your regrets with other people. Because and by the way, the Catholic Church has been doing this for years. We call this confession. So it's institutionalized in some world religions. But there's also an aspect of self-distancing that comes along with this. Of if we take ourselves out of the situation, and if we can just imagine, what if the shoe were on the other foot? Right? We even have an expression in English about that. What if the shoe were on the other foot? If I frame something as being kind of weird for me, as if I reached out to you, for instance, if I'm hesitating reaching out to you and I'm thinking that that's going to be weird, what if I put the shoe on the other foot and say, what would it be like if Kurt reached out to me? Yeah. I wouldn't feel weird about that. So I need to self-distance and ask that question in a way that gets me away from that lack of self-compassion, lack of, the self-distancing really helps.
I love that. And the way you said that, and Dan talked a little bit about that, and read the book, because there's some really good stuff in there about that. But this idea that, hey, if I feel something is going to be creepy, but then if I do it, but if I, like reaching out, but then you ask me the question, well, what if that person reached out to you and you said, no, that'd be great. Wow. Yeah. But it's hard. It's hard to put that, because there is the kind of this reverse, attribution error that we have on that, right?
I know.
And so
that weird?
It is. It's weird, because if somebody, I can say, well, yeah, it'd be fine, but no, it's still creepy for me to do it. And so, it's difficult, but I think that's really cool. And this idea of self-distancing, I love we talked about this at the beginning, the talk in third person, recite what you just did as a third person, talk like Elmo, like this, that kind of thing, or do in your head, just visit the future and what's it going to be like in 5 years, that, oh, well, it's not so big anymore. And you can distance it from time. You can distance it emotionally and distance it in space as well. Let's talk about anticipated regret, because this is a key concept. And it's a key concept that I think has some real power to it. It's this idea that Alfred Nobel, put the Nobel Prize up and did all of that because he read a fake, obituary about himself, and he was feeling regret that they were, putting his name out as just this killer of people. And so he regretted that, and thus he was motivated to change what his life was about.
Yeah, it's a great thing to use this anticipated regret to fast forward into the future, tell the story of what my life would be like if I make this decision today. But it only is really good for big things. Don't get caught up in using it for every little thing with the, should I have that extra Oreo? Don't, it will kill you.
Annie Duke says, in just making good decisions, is like, don't fret over having the salmon or the cod for dinner at your restaurant. Just choose one and just go with it, because it's not that big a deal. And we do, but we have anticipated regret. And sometimes we don't realize that that's what's going on. And that, like in the idea when we talked about changing your test answer, right? It's not known. We're not cognitively going, oh, I won't change this, because if I change it, I'll feel worse than if I got it wrong because I didn't change it and all this. So we might have to go and examine our lives and say, where are those places that this anticipated regret on these small things is getting in our way? And then setting up maybe a when then statement, when I feel this, I should change an answer on my test that I've already written, I will change that answer, right? And just do that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Kurt. How about if we just cover regret and agency, this whole free will versus, things happen for a reason?
Yeah, and Dan brings this up in the book, and it's really fascinating to me because he talks about this from the perspective of, he asked two questions in the survey. One was, do we control our lives? Do we have control? Automaticity, right? Agency, not automaticity. Or do things happen for a reason? And when he asked this question, he got pretty big. Yeah, we control our lives. Lots of people said yes, but then lots of people also said, do things happen for a reason?
They said yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so he's thinking about this, and he talks about this as this idea that's kind of in conflict, because if we are in control, but they happen for a reason, then there's this. But I have a different take on this, which is this idea that, when we think about controlling our lives, but when we also think about do things happen for a reason, it goes to this point of, do we put meaning to our lives? In other words, is it a construct? In other words, this idea that we have an inflection point in our lives, that we had this regret, and because of that regret, our lives went one direction as opposed to the trajectory they were on before. And in retrospect, we look at this and say, see, that was a reason for where I am today. And it's not necessarily saying it was prospective, that regret happened to push me onto that path, but it's retrospective to say, I had that regret, and because of that, I took a different path. And because of that different
I'm drawing meaning.
And I'm drawing meaning from that. And so so that happened for a reason.
It's the reason that I'm giving it.
Yeah, I'm giving it that reason. It's not saying that there's a God or a game machiner who's putting these regrets in our lives to, move us down through the maze of life. No, it's this retrospective component.
I wonder, I think I love that perspective, by the way. And I just want to say two things about it. One is I'm wondering, and I'm truly curious as to whether or not people think about this when they answer a question, things happen for a reason, if they're thinking prospectively, if they're thinking that there is this motion and momentum that led them to this point, some hand of God thing, whatever. Or if they are conflating it or fundamentally sort of switching it around when they're actually doing what you're saying is retrospectively giving it meaning and saying, well, it happened for a reason because I'm giving it a reason now later in life. And they're just kind of screwing that up. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I am too. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really good question, but it is an interesting piece. It also gets back to this idea, like this no regret statement that goes out there. And again, I don't think people, when they say, maybe some of them do, like they want to live a life with no regrets. Again, that's fanciful thinking, right? We all have regrets, as we've talked about. But this idea that I can learn from those regrets, that I will then become a better person. And so therefore, that regret is no longer a regret because I have taken the bad action that I've done and I have made amends around it and improved myself for a future better life, which again goes to that last paragraph that Dan has that I love, this idea that, regret, makes me human, regret makes me better, and regret gives me hope. And I just love that as a way to think about this. And it's pretty powerful when you think about it.
And with that, Groovers, I want to say thank you. We want to express our gratitude for you hanging in with us for another grooving session, for a wonderful conversation with Dan.
And hopefully you didn't regret listening to this entire episode and that you got some insightful from this. And if you did, please share it with a friend, post something about it in social media, get the word out there. Because one of the things that we will regret is if this is only to a small group of people and we want it to go out to lots of people and learn and grow from this. So really, thank you for listening. And with that, make sure you go out and find your groove this week.